Kryn 5 had always been a world of harsh beauty, its icy expanses glittering beneath a violet sky. The storms that swept across its surface were legendary. Blizzards so fierce they seemed alive, howling and tearing at anything left exposed. Yet, it was home to the Krynish people, a hardy, elegant race whose monarch, Varlos, had led them through years of interstellar conflict and political strife. His leadership was respected, his strength unmatched, but now even he could feel his grip. Slipping, it wasn't the freezing winds or the endless snow that troubled him most. The danger came from within his own ranks. For weeks, Varlos had sensed the growing dissent among his council. Whispers of a coup had reached his ears, their venomous threads weaving a tapestry of betrayal. His enemies were waiting for him to stumble. They knew he would go to great lengths to protect his family, and that knowledge had become their weapon. Kalyra, his wife, had begged him to flee with them. "We can find refuge on one of the border colonies," she urged, her voice steady but her luminous golden eyes betraying her fear. "You don't have to face them alone." Varlos had grasped her hands tightly. "If I run, I'm no king," he'd replied. "But if I fall, they'll come for you and the children. I must face this my way." That night, under the dim light of Kryn 5's twin moons, Varlos made his decision. He guided Kalyra and their two young children, Jin and Mali, into a hidden ravine. It was a secluded place, sheltered from the worst of the storm. There he left them with provisions and the promise of his return. Kalyra protested, her voice rising above the winds, but Varlos cut her off with a look. "You must trust me. I'll come back for you, I swear it." He walked away into the storm, his silhouette vanishing into the swirling white. Kalyra called after him, her voice raw and desperate, but he didn't look back. As the hours passed, the storm grew stronger. Kalyra huddled with her children under the makeshift shelter Varlos had left. The wind screamed like a living thing, clawing at the structure and shaking the icy ground. She held Jin and Mali close, whispering to them in their native tongue, recounting old tales of Krynish heroes who overcame even the most brutal winters. But the stories, which once brought comfort, now felt thin and hollow. Days went by. The snow continued to fall, a ceaseless blanket of white. Supplies dwindled faster than Kalyra had expected. The caches Varlos had promised seemed far too small for their needs, and she began to wonder if he had overestimated their resilience. Or perhaps he had underestimated the storm. Each day she ventured out briefly, searching for anything that might sustain them. Her hands grew raw, her strength waning, but her determination never faltered. She had to keep her children alive. And yet every night Kalyra looked to the horizon, hoping to see the figure of her husband returning through the snow. But the horizon remained empty, the storm relentless. A seed of doubt planted itself deep in her heart. Had Varlos truly been unable to return, or had he chosen not to? The days stretched into weeks and hope began to crumble. Kalyra, once a steadfast and formidable figure, now moved through each moment in a haze of exhaustion. The tiny food cache left by Varlos had nearly run out. They were down to a few nutrient impacts, each barely providing enough sustenance to keep her children conscious. The brutal cold gnawed at their resilience, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Jin, the eldest, had grown quiet and withdrawn. At 9 cycles old, he was old enough to understand the dire situation they were in, but too young to offer real solutions. His once bright eyes now seemed dulled, shadowed by hunger and cold. He tried to help his mother by searching the frozen ground for edible roots, but the storm had buried everything under meters of unyielding snow. His younger sister, Mali, just 6 cycles old, relied on Kalyra to keep her warm and calm, her small body trembling as the chill sank deeper into their shelter each night. Kalyra's heart broke to see her children like this. She held them close, wrapping her slender arms around their small, fragile frames. The fabric of her thermal suit had begun to tear, no longer providing full protection against the punishing wind that seeped through the cracks of their makeshift shelter. Her only solace was that the structure still held together, the jagged rock overhang offering some reprieve from the worst of the elements. But even that seemed like a fragile victory. Her days became a pattern of survival. Every morning she'd check the supplies, willing there to be more than she'd counted the night before. She'd venture out, clawing at the ice-crusted soil, hoping to uncover something edible. Roots, fungi, anything. But the world outside had turned to stone, frozen solid under the storm's endless assault. Her hands became raw and frostbitten, her once strong frame now shaking from malnourishment. She needed to stay strong for her children, but each step grew heavier, each breath harder to take. At night she would tell them stories to keep their spirits up. They were the same old legends of Krynnish heroes who endured blizzards and battled the beasts of the north, but her voice was weaker now, and the words felt less like hope and more like a distant memory. Jin and Marley listened in silence, their faces pale and gaunt, their young bodies curling closer to hers for warmth. As time passed, Kalira couldn't help but feel the stirrings of anger and confusion. Where was Varlos? He had promised to come back. Surely he knew they couldn't survive. Like this indefinitely. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, trying to remember if he'd said anything more, given any clue about how long he would be gone. She remembered the firmness in his voice when he'd told her to trust him. But trust felt like a fragile thread, fraying with every icy gust that rattled their shelter. Kalira kept moving, kept searching, kept trying, but she couldn't ignore the truth. They were running out of time. Dr. Eli Warren had lived on Kryn 5 for over a year, stationed at a remote outpost established by the United Galactic Aid Corps. It was meant to be a beacon of help for stranded travelers and refugees, anyone caught in the planet's deadly winters. But few came. Kryn 5's reputation as a frozen wasteland kept most sentient beings far away. The storms were too fierce, the landscape too hostile. Eli had spent countless days listening to the wind howl outside the walls of his shelter. His primary companions, the humming machinery of his equipment, and the occasional crackle of long-distance comms chatter. One night, as the storm seemed at its peak, Eli's equipment registered faint heat signatures. At first, he thought it might be a glitch, an artifact of the storm's shifting temperatures, but the readings persisted. There were 3 sources clustered together, their thermal output weak but distinct. He knew that if they were organic, they wouldn't survive much longer. Kryn 5's cold didn't just bite, it consumed. Eli moved quickly, packing emergency supplies into his hover sled. He grabbed his field medical kit, thermal tents, and portable rations. Checking his wrist-mounted navigator, he charted a route that would take him to the heat signatures without losing his way in the blizzard. His outpost was equipped with a reinforced climate suit, but even that wouldn't keep him safe for long. If the weather turned worse, he had to be fast. The journey was harrowing. The storm screamed around him, white-out conditions making it almost impossible to see. He relied on his instruments, the sled's faint beeping guiding him toward the source. When he finally reached the site, his heart sank. The shelter was crude, little more than a rocky overhang propped up by scavenged materials. Inside, he found them, a Krynnish woman and 2 children barely clinging to life. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, their skin ashen and frostbitten. Eli wasted no time. He erected the portable thermal tent and activated its heating systems. The air inside quickly became warm and humid, a stark contrast to the deadly cold. Outside, he began checking each of them in turn. The woman was unconscious, her pulse faint but steady. The children were in worse shape. Their tiny forms curled against each other in a futile attempt to conserve heat. The medic's hands moved, swiftly and steadily. He administered a warming injection to stabilize their core temperatures, then carefully draped thermal blankets over their frail bodies. He opened his medkit and applied a salve to their frostbitten skin, murmuring soothing words, despite knowing they couldn't understand him. He wasn't fluent in the Krynnish language, but compassion didn't require translation. After several hours of painstaking effort, the youngest child stirred. The girl, her golden eyes dimmed but still luminous, looked up at him with confusion. Eli smiled, holding up his hands in a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Soon the boy woke as well, blinking up at the human who had come out of nowhere to save them. The woman remained unconscious, her condition critical. Eli worked through the night, never once stopping, his determination as unyielding as the storm. Outside, he'd seen too many lives lost to Kryn 5's cold. He wasn't about to add 3 more. It took 3 days for Kalira to fully regain consciousness. When she woke, her body ached and her mind swam with fragmented memories of the storm. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The air around her was warm, the howling wind replaced by a low, steady hum. The ceiling above was curved and metallic, not the jagged rock she'd last seen. Her children lay nearby, bundled in strange blankets that radiated heat, their small faces no longer pale and gaunt. A human stood over her, his eyes kind, his hands carefully adjusting a device that blinked with faint green lights. He noticed her stirring and leaned down, speaking words she couldn't understand. Yet his tone was calm, reassuring, as he gestured toward a ration pack. Kalira sat up slowly, her mind catching up to her body. "Who?" she began in her native Krynnish. Tongue, her voice raspy. The human paused, then pointed to himself. "Eli," he said clearly before pointing to her. "You." "Kalira," she managed after a moment. "Jin, Marley," she added, gesturing weakly toward her children. The human, Eli, nodded, his expression lightening. He pointed to the children, then back to her as if confirming their names. She gave a faint smile, grateful that he at least understood the basics. Over the next few days, as she regained her strength, Kalira pieced together what had happened. Eli was part of a humanitarian effort, stationed on the planet to provide emergency aid. He had found them at the brink of death, brought them into his shelter, and nursed them back to life. He showed her the devices he had used: thermal tents, portable heaters, and medical supplies. Although they didn't share a common language, his gestures and expressions communicated what words could not. They were safe now. For Jin and Marley, the change was miraculous. Jin began exploring the small outpost, fascinated by Eli's gadgets. He discovered a tablet that displayed moving images, and though the stories it told were foreign, he was captivated. Marley took comfort in the warmth and food, her energy returning. Quickly, she even laughed when Eli made exaggerated faces or performed small tricks with his equipment. The storm still raged outside, but within the outpost, life began to return. Kalira, however, couldn't stop thinking about Varlos. She still didn't know why he hadn't come back. She felt a mix of emotions: relief that her children were alive, gratitude toward this human who had saved them, and anger toward her husband for leaving them behind. When Eli brought out a datapad and showed her a map of the planet, she realized he wanted to help them leave Kryn 5 altogether. Eli pointed to a spot on the map and then to the ceiling, mimicking a ship's ascent. Kalira understood. He wanted to get them to safety off this frozen world. It was a daring plan. They would need to reach a larger outpost or perhaps a passing ship that could take them to one of the warmer colonies. She had never considered leaving Kryn 5. This was her home, the place her people had lived for generations. But now, faced with the reality of their survival, she knew it might be the only option. Together, they began preparing for the journey. Eli gathered his equipment, packing enough food and thermal gear for all of them. Kalira helped as best she could, her strength still returning. Jin and Mali clung to her, their spirits lifted by the promise of a future beyond the endless storms. On the day they left, the storm had lessened, though the wind still cut sharply against their thermal suits. Eli led the way, using his navigator to guide them through the frozen landscape. Kalira carried Mali on her back, while Jin walked beside her, clutching her hand. The journey was grueling, but Eli's knowledge of the terrain and his advanced gear kept them moving steadily toward their destination. After several days, they reached a landing site where a small transport shuttle awaited. It was cramped but warm, and as the engines roared to life, Kalira looked back through the small viewport. She saw the white expanse of Kryn 5 shrinking behind them, the storm still swirling like a restless spirit. She held her children close, tears streaming down her face. Varlos was gone, perhaps forever, but she had saved her family. She silently thanked Eli for his courage and kindness. For the first time in weeks, Kalira felt a spark of hope. They were alive, they were together, and they had a chance at a new beginning.